Yeah, good morning. मैं सोच रहा हूँ कि सारे लोग तो अंग्रेज़ी समझते हैं, तो अफसोस की बात है कि मैं अपना काम उर्दू में ज़्यादा अच्छी तरह समझा नहीं सकता हूँ। इसलिए तो आपकी इजाज़त से तो मैं अंग्रेज़ी में बोलूँगा। Uh, Thank you so much for the invitation, and I strongly support the initiative of the SIO to invite students and encourage them, students within Muslim Islamic background, to inquire, to study society, and to engage with society in a wider context. And it is especially a need in a time when lines of polarization in the political world, in the social world, in the academic world are being drawn ever sharper. And I think it is very important to engage with the world as it is. Before I briefly introduce my own research work about Muslim movements in South Asia, I wanted to add a couple of remarks to the introductory speeches that were made here. And I was just feeling that it is nowadays also perhaps very useful to remind ourselves of the beginning of Islam, when the Prophet initiated the constitution of Medina. As a non-believer, I can say that we still, until today, can learn a lot from the level of integration and toleration, also between believers and non-believers, that this document showed and holds basically still valid until today. I would even venture to say and argue in the spirit of a discussion that in the sense and through the Constitution of Medina, Islam was the first secular religion that was established. Why? Because it strongly established institutional engagement between believers and non-believers. As far as I remember, he constituted the Ummah in the sense that it consisted both of the believers, the Mu'mineen, and the non-believers, the people of the tribes, and there was even a very active engagement with the Jewish community as an ally to be included. In this sense, I would argue in favor of looking at this world today not so much in terms of mutually exclusive categories, but at different perspectives that we take, where different perspectives can always combine and can produce combined results. For instance, the subcontinent has known and has stood out in the history of Islam as producing Islamic socialists like Maulana Ubaidullah Sindhi, or like Barkatullah, who wrote a book, Islam and Socialism, in 1918, 1920. So you can see that different Muslim thinkers, different Muslims have engaged with different philosophies and different concepts of governance in different ways over time. And so, in fact, have also done Western philosophies, where I would argue Western philosophy either cannot be reduced to materialism, because it has always been in a dialogue between moral philosophy and material philosophy, and moral frames have always been important for believers of the three big monotheistic religions, as well as for believers of the other religions, as well as for non-believers. And moral frames, I would argue, will always have an importance for interaction and for the determination of values between materialistic frames, with organization of life, with organizing ways of living in the world as it is. And this brings me also to the topic of my own research, that has been to highlight the character and the nature of Muslim institutional actors from South Asia and their global role. Why we in the West and why academics would want to look at it, I believe I have to explain, and the reason is simply that still today in the West and in global communication in general, it is often underestimated the role that South Asian Islam and South Asian Muslims could play, or would be playing. That in fact South Asia, by certain perspectives, is seen as being at the margin of the Islamic world, with the center in the Arabic in the Arabian Peninsula. But in fact, we know, and I cannot highlight it enough, also while I am in Europe and when I am in Germany, that there are 600 million Muslims in South Asia, which is twice the number of Arabic-speaking Muslims, so that it is also the region with the largest number of Muslims if we go by regions, and therefore it plays an important role in the Muslim world as such. But not only that, what is particularly important to understand is that all Muslim groups and institutional Muslim actors from South Asia, from the Deobandis or the Tabligis, the Barelvis, the Al-Hadis, even certain Shia groups, and also, in our perspective at least, the Ahmadis, all have reached in their impact beyond South Asia. That is, they have become global actors. That is, South Asian Islam has become a source of global intervention and global interaction that is based on different, is rooted in different factors, in different moments. One of them definitely is the aspiration itself of Islam, of being a global religion, having their own understanding of the world as a complete global system. Others are more, how to say, materialistic, in the sense that the British Empire in itself created some form of globalization in its own time, a historical form of globalization, when Muslims from South Asia were moving and were going to other countries, settling in other countries. For instance, particularly South Africa, where there is a very strong and active Muslim minority of South Asian descent. And then there is an earlier factor, even, that Muslim trading groups, trading castes from South Asia, especially from Gujarat, made their way to other parts of the world and thereby established this connectivity. And to these factors, historical and religious, current factor is added the recent labor migration, which established strong Muslim diasporas of South Asian descent in, for instance, the United States, or Canada, where there had been no colonial or trade or historical direct interaction per se. And these interactions show that there has been a global understanding of the role of each of these Muslim groups and an understanding that goes beyond the origin and the original country and the roots where they came from. It is still in the West very rarely understood and acknowledged that movements such as the Tablighi Jamaat or even the Deobandis and Ibn Barewis, that their centers of origin are located in today's India. And what other factor comes to it that is related to the migration process is, of course, that of globalization. Globalization means that distance and time are shrinking because of new means of communication and new means of moving. And we, or certain academics to whom I belong, we argue that the understanding of globalization cannot be reduced to financial factors, to financial processes, but rather has to be seen more inclusive as a process of social and cultural communication. And in this communication process, religion, which we as non-believer academics regard as a social activity primarily, religion plays an important role because religion creates a certain set of affinity that binds people together beyond their place of origin while they are moving around the world. An outstanding example of this global activism, no doubt, is the role of the Tablighi Jamaat that has become a global actor of Islam, as it is present in not only all Muslim countries, but even in those societies where, in every society literally, where Muslims live. And in academic terms of going across borders and globalization, the Tablighi Jamaat crossed, so to say, the boundaries of ethnic origin, because we have many countries where the membership of the movement is entirely local and native. So it has, in a way, crossed this ethnic divide, and it is seen in parts of the Muslim world as a normative, what we call a normative actor of Islam, a normative institutional actor of Islam, that, which for some reasons in some countries is not even known as belonging to or originating from South Asia. For instance, in France, almost all Tablighi members are, if not of French ethnic, at least of North African ethnic descent. We have a similar composition in Indonesia, in Malaysia, for instance, whereas the membership in countries like the UK is much more of Indian or South Asian or Pakistani descent. So this is the expansion or the interaction or intervention of Muslim actors from South Asia in regions beyond the origins. And what is more important, or what is additionally important with it, is that I'm trying to understand and also trying to show to the academic readership how these networks, how these institutions function, how their connectivity functions, how the communication works. And the background is not political or security concerns. On the contrary, the background is to show that here we are dealing with what can say ordinary, mamuli kind of social groups cultural groups, networks that organize themselves in ways how similar networks from other religions or other backgrounds do as well. For instance, similar global activism is shown by Sikh networks or by Hindu networks, but not based on religion. Here in South Asia, you have a similar global connectivity among the Tamils living in different parts of the world. There are minorities in Sri Lanka or in Malaysia, and the diasporas in the US and the UK. So what you have, in fact, in times of globalization, you have a plurality of worlds. A plurality of worlds which I think, or we think, is important to show and to understand and to remove the bias that globalization is just a one-sided process coming from one angle from the West, or that it is dominated by financial institutions in the West. The reality is different. The reality is that globalization is a pluralistic process where other religious and cultural ethnic actors have their own perspective, have their own worldview, and are engaged in acts of world making. And this is perhaps the last one I want to make to explain what we mean by world making. World making means that in times where distances shrink and where you are easily connected, not only through the internet, but also literally and physically with other parts of the world, your activity beyond the borders is sometimes driven by money, by income, and by career and by other concerns, which do not need to be in contradiction or in mutual exclusion with your other references, with moral references, with religious references, or with cultural identities. We know that these activities are combined very often, that for instance, Gujarati traders are supporting religious activities in East Africa or in South Africa. At the same time, they are using these connections for conducting their businesses, for conducting the trade. But acts of world making mean that you are trying to give a certain meaning to your trans-local, trans-regional intervention. And what meaning you give to it, it very much depends on your own original affiliation and association and attachment. So the Muslim groups that originate from South Asia, they are engaged in acts of giving meaning to crossing borders. Why do Muslims coming from South Asia, from India, from Pakistan, from Bangladesh remain attached to a particular loyalty, to a particular network, to a particular institution? Because there is a set of meanings involved, and that gives them some identity, some rooting, which otherwise you may easily lose when you are crossing the border. In that sense, South Asian Islam and South Asian Muslim are, how to say, a prime example of the pluralism and even, I would argue, the toleration, the internal pluralism and the external pluralism of this process of globalization, where they are not only or are not at the receiving end, but also initiate global process, where they themselves are initiating global intervention and play an active role in many ways. And I think this differentiated role needs to be highlighted in order to expand and the understanding of Muslims from South Asia, but also of Islam in general for non-believers, as going beyond very acute political and security concerns that often nowadays dominate. Uh, on the last note, I would also argue in terms of globalization for the need of change of perspective. As much as I argue in the West when I am in Germany or in Europe to change perspective and also consider the perspectives of Muslims acting out of South Asia, I would also appeal to here in South Asia Muslims to also change perspective occasionally and try to understand why particular concerns are coming up, why there is a rise of fear, anxieties over migrants. Because whoever of you has been to Europe or to the West and has come close to a situation of violence or militancy will understand that the common people who do not necessarily understand the complexity of international cultural and religious structures and networks are often driven by very mundane fears. And what we can do is nowadays to enhance communication, to enhance understanding of each other's worlds so that the pluralism of this world can produce positive results. Because one thing is sure, there is no going back to a homogeneous, unitary world in whatever way. The world will remain pluralistic, and it is our task, I believe, to make it possible that this pluralism can interact in a positive way, enhancing each other's sharing and living of this one world. Thank you. So I'm not familiar with the procedures here, but I would understand there is now room for questions. If the organizers can help me.
This is the time for question and answer. Delegates and audience can intervention to the session.
To those who are also curious about what we have written and what I have written on my research, I would invite you to visit my profile at the internet website academia.edu, which is what you can call a Facebook for academics. And on that website, I've put in my profile a number of articles I've written on various of these subjects.
If anybody want mic, then volunteers manage it.
This is Abdul Mateen doing PhD in Jawaharlal University on the idea of Bengali Muslims. My question is to sir, you have coined the term South Asian Islam. When South Asian Islams interact with the European Islam for that matter, in Europe, what kind of, I would say that after interactions, what kind of repercussions are there in the South Asian society here? After interacting with European Islam, what kind of interaction is there what kind of repercussion is there in the South Asian Islamic society? Second thing is that as far as the complexities of South Asian Islam is concerned, for instance, the Bengali Muslims identity as such. Generally the Bengali identity, Muslims identity have always been seen from the two perspective, whether you're Bengali first or the Muslim first. Generally the upper caste Hindus, they think that you are not Bengali enough, and on the other hand the so-called elite and then the Urdu speaking Ashraf Muslim, they think that they are not Muslims enough. When these two things comes in, do you see any changes when the South Asian Muslims community go to West, how they deals, whether the Bangladeshi diaspora is very strong over there, how they do interact with the Indian elites and then the Bangladeshi or Bengali Islam.
Thank you for your questions. Well, I'm not sure I'm fully able to answer them sufficiently at the moment. Uh, what I would argue in the interaction with European Islam, that I would argue against looking at European Islam as something different or something, how to say, cut off from developments in the other parts. This would kind of be an Orientalist perspective, which I am against. I normally argue that the developments and the tensions are very much driven by social factors, by education, by also economic challenges, and they spread around the world. For instance, if you take the role of women in European Islam or the role of native languages, yes, in the beginning, Muslims who came to Europe, they largely acted in their own mother tongues previously, but then over time, new organizations developed in Germany. We have new organizations that exclusively operate in German, a number of mosques that exclusively operate in German, and also we have groups, NGOs in a way, academic NGOs you can say, which are run by Muslim women who are having, who took the role of producing, for instance, pedagogical material for teaching Islam in schools. In Germany, all religions have the right to provide voluntary religious lessons in all public schools. And over the last years, the share of education or teaching of Islam by different groups has grown, and the teaching material for that has to be produced in German. And these two ladies who are running this NGO, they have also classical religious education. One of them is by family related to one of the former leaders of Turkish Islamic movement. So there are these connections, but is such a trend, is such a development exclusive to Europe or to Germany? Not at all. And is it only that these changes in South Asia happen as a result of interaction? I don't think so, because there has recently been a lot of movement here in the Islamic field regarding the role of women and girls. For instance, you know probably better than I do how many girls madrasas have come up recently, and they produce female religious scholars, alima, and the graduation of alimas poses enormous challenges for gender relations, for family relations, that we are coming to see who in a family with one alim and one alima, who will be having the right to determine what has to be done and what not, and who can be silenced and who not. These are interesting questions, developments, challenges that come up in South Asia itself. And we have in Pakistan, the Huda Foundation, for instance, run by a woman with their own institutions. So there is an international discourse, international argument about Islamic feminism, which comes back to the beginning of what I said. There is no mutual exclusivity and contradiction between various philosophies and social approaches, because there are lots of overlaps in this increasingly pluralist world. If these, there is some problem with the mic. Or I can also try to sometimes produces the result that Muslim groups in Europe or in the West emerge which focus more on issues rather than on ethnic origin. So you have these two trends. You have so-called ethnic mosques, where people of a particular background go, but then on the other hand, you have other institutions, mosques, where people focus on particular programs, on particular perspectives. Take, for example, the increase in so-called Salafi mosques in Europe, which emphasize reformism and a particular approach to Islam. Why so-called Salafism? Because Salafism in itself, academics argue, is a pluralistic phenomenon, which contains different directions, ranging from academic to political to militant approaches, and from state Islam like in Saudi Arabia to Muslim Brotherhood in other countries. So even Salafism cannot be reduced to one single phenomenon. Is it working again? Yes, so I don't have to shout anymore. Yeah, well, that's what I would say in brief to these two questions.
Myself, Mohammed Fuzair from JNU, pursuing MA Arabic. My question is regarding your statement about Tablighi Jamaat. You extensively talked about Tablighi Jamaat and its role in your brief orientation. So my question is regarding distinction between Christian missionaries and Tablighi Jamaat globally. Or in other words, what is your opinion about their roles and their distinction features?
It all depends from which perspective you're looking at it, because if you're not taking a particular stake in their conversion missions, then obviously structurally there is a lot of similarity, and I have had the privilege to talk to a young Mormon preacher who was, for instance, an American who based in Europe and who attended an academic conference at our institute where I was speaking about my research on the Tablighi Jamaat, and we later talked about that there is a lot of institutional and structural similarities in the way of operation, and the way a particular movement operates. The intizam does not have to, I mean, it can be called religious, but it doesn't have to be called religious. It can also be applied to different settings. So the formats and the systems and the ways of organization, they also move around the world and move between different genres, move between different settings. So obviously there is a mutual influence also of these different formats. And that is not so surprising, because in the end they share the same intention of bringing their particular ideas out to other people and convince them how to do it. And they organize in similar ways, including sending preachers out, having in-house, in-staff meetings where they summarize the results, where the people have to give reports and summaries on what they have done, and then there is a working plan, and all these details. But such procedures don't even have to be limited to the field of religious missionary activity. I mean, you will undertake similar activities if you have the task, let's say, you're running a company and you want to extend the grip of the company around the world. You will probably also adopt one or the other similar procedures, or if you are doing a global NGO. So the challenge, the task is there, that you engage with the world as it is, and then you come up with solutions that may not be so different in every case.
Myself, Mohammed Rafi from Kashmir, doing PhD in sociology. So my question is simple, and you talk in the global context that in the last we need to have perspectives changing. How the Eastern Muslims look at the West and how the West looks at the East. In the global context, today what we see that democratically elected governments of the West, what they are doing in the Muslim states, particularly, whoever reason to look at the West as a democratic militants, like that situation. Like that we have seen in Afghanistan, be it in democratically elected Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, be it now in Syria and rest, Libya and all that perspective. And in your lecture you said that it's mundane way of life, how a European looks at the migrants and all that. But the reason is who made them to migrate? Who invaded their homeland? Why there are issues? And how can we resolve this stereotyping of each other? And as a Muslim and in this global context world, my opinion and my observation as a sociology student is that first you need to look at the reason why this is emerging. Like that now Europe is looking at the Muslims as immigrants and threat to their own society. But the reason is that first we need to look why they had been turned to be the threat creating people. By invading their own homelands, turning them hostile, destroying their each and every right. And my question to Sir is that how can this perspective be changed in a global context when everything is open to everybody, be it a Western, be it a Muslim of the East?
Obviously, there is no easy solution to that, and obviously, I cannot give the solution here now. But I think that what we can try is to understand what is, so to say, the structural environment in which we are operating. That I would argue it is necessary to go beyond certain polarities and certain assumptions, to challenge them, to understand that the situation in every single case is more complex. As much as Muslims do not want the world over to be held responsible for every single terror act with which they don't agree and with which had been undertaken in the name of Islam, also democracies per se cannot be undertaken for any wrong that is wrongly undertaken in the name of democracy. It is a similar generalizing as in the other way. We indeed need differentiation, and then the situation looks quite complicated. When the Americans intervened in Afghanistan, it were three parties which were sitting together at one table deciding how to do it. It was the Americans, the Saudis, and Zia-ul-Haq. The Americans were giving the arms, the Saudis were giving the money, and Zia-ul-Haq insisted he should have control over the militants who should do the intervention. So there is a, how to say, if you want to put it that way, combination or share of guilt between different parties, and every single party is also a particular political leader, a particular administration, which in itself cannot be held responsible for the whole country as a total. Does it mean that we can now condemn once and for all the Pakistan people because of that, or the American people, or the Saudi people? No, we cannot, because it was the result of a particular political administration and constellation which decided to move in that way. And many people agreed that this was a wrong and ill-conceived move. But what I'm saying is that these so-called Western interventions are very often the product of very close collaboration with particular local elites, who are, in fact, inviting this intervention and who are using this intervention to perpetuate their power over parts of the population. So we're having a very complicated and deadly dancing in the international environment, and if we like it or not, after the end of the Cold War, it has become even more complicated, because the kind of alliances that were supposedly there and that were kind of giving a semblance of control have also disappeared. So in our own interest, we are well advised to differentiate and between different situations, different stakeholders and different interventions, and to see how this comes about, who shares the role and the responsibility, and why, what was the reason, and what is the way out of it. There are in this world, there are no easy solutions.
Sir, my name is Khairunisa and I'm doctoral candidate at Center for West Asian Studies, JNU. My question is that you just mentioned cross-border and transnational networking of different Islamic groups. My question is that, do you see these transnational or cross-border networkings are posing any threat to the present world order? And how do you see these networkings affecting international politics in future? So my another question is that, how do you see that Islamic framework has capacity to absorb feminism?
The first, I was actually trying to say that the type of networking I was describing is not an issue of security or political concern, but rather it's a social issue. Take, for instance, the network of the Barelvi movement, Minhaj al-Quran, where led by Tahir al-Qadri in Pakistan. They have very active branches all over the world. One reason for these branches is also quite mundane, that is collecting chanda, money from the better earning migrants to support the whole movement. But then the movement also creates schools, creates particular educational institutions, and helps to kind of create a middle class education framework. So it's a kind of NGO activity in some way, which is partly benefiting Muslim society, but it's organizing itself by using the crossing of borders as a means of operation in the countries, in the UK or elsewhere. It also serves as a service point for migrants, if you want to put it there, to help them reconnecting with their identity, to give them legal advice. So all these are activities, and that's what I'm actually trying to highlight when I discuss these activities, which have nothing to do with policy or security concerns. In fact, there is always, and very often in the media, a lot of, how to put it, miscommunication about the threats to world order or security concerns or militancy. There are separate studies which somehow never are discussed in the media, always disappear, showing that it is not graduates of madrasas who are the highest number of participants in the militant acts of or suicide missions, but it's often networks of friends, and many of them are actually school dropouts of public schools with a missed career. So the guidance of these people by madrasa is very limited. There are a few militant networks in Pakistan, like the LAT and the Jaish. They have started their own madrasas, and there they have a twisted curriculum where they also teach a twisted concept of jihad. But they are not really active in the sense of creating branches or madrasas outside Europe, outside South Asia. So the groups that I am talking about, it is really some sort of a social, cultural activism, if you want to put it that way. And in that sense, it is important to see it in a very sober, in a very regular light, and that's why I feel like I'm describing this as a regular activity precisely to undermine the specter of fear that sometimes dominated communication. Well, your second question regarding feminism, I already mentioned it, that there is an active discourse on Islamic feminism already. So this is nothing new. I mean, there is, the most famous author is actually of Pakistan origin, Saba Mahmood, teaching anthropology in California, and she wrote about empowerment of women through religious activism in Egypt. A famous book which is already, I don't remember, 10, 15 years old. So the discussion goes for quite some time that all over the world, in different ways, formats are emerging where women also in the name of Islam play a more active role in society. That is a reality.
Dear audience, this is the time for the last question because we
Sir.
want to go to the next session.
I'm Alif Jahan. I'm a student of Tata Institute of Social Sciences. So, I like to ask about the common Muslim community, the common Muslim community. So, whenever there are terror attacks done by the Islamic militants or Islamic terrorists, the Muslim community is having to, somehow condemn it by various means. For example, the ulamas have to, they have to release fatwas denouncing these terror attacks, and the Jamaat-e-Islami Hind also conducted some kind of seminars which said that this is not Islam, that IIIAC is not Islam. And this is on one hand, and on the other hand, we have extremist group of other religions, like for example the Ku Klux Klan, the KKK in the Europe. So they are also conducting such kind of extremist activities. But people belonging to those communities, they are not having to condemn those attacks. They're not having to criticize them. Or why is it that the world only expects Muslims to do such kind of condemnation? Thank you.
Well, it is true and it is not true. If you look at the elections in America, then you see the debates and the discourse is very much about the candidates and the politicians trying to prove that conservatism and hatred is not part or is not originally the American society approach, is not the way of life, is not what it should be like. Ku Klux Klan actually is an American phenomenon, and the existence of white supremacists and of racism in America is and of racism is acknowledged and also challenged, and you can say America feels challenged to constantly excuse itself for these acts. Just the other day, Barack Obama was talking about these acts, how he feels basically, even as president, having limited ways and power to do away or to limit these excesses, and having to basically apologize before the world. So in that sense it is not true. But yes, also there is a bias currently, as I explained before, in the international media, a bias which also has to do with communication, where I am saying this is a problem that cannot be solved by some people or actors or activists only. Everyone has to get involved in communication, that explaining to the other side, not familiar with your own culture and society and religion, what's going on there and why is this happening and why this is not happening and who is responsible and who is not. Because unfortunately, this sort of knowledge and this communication is not very common. Just let me add one more remark to that, why we do have this trend internationally of people who suddenly feel they need to take rescue in very severe forms of ethnic and religious activism, or what we call national conservative governments are having a particular concept which is strongly rooted in identity, in local, regional identity, local religious identity, local ethnic identity. You have this kind of approaches, you can argue, are shared by Putin, by Erdogan, by the Japanese Prime Minister, by the Hungarian Prime Minister, by the Brexit campaign, even by Trump. Why is that so? Is that a coincidence? Uh, there are scholars who argue to be more careful about the analysis of the reasons because they point to the emergence and the existence of certain social groups within all those countries that feel unable to deal with the current changes and the current situation in the world, that feel neglected and that feel they are no longer being asked and consulted and taken on board in what's happening in their society. And I think there will be no solution and no peace coming back to the world if politicians don't start to take such concerns more seriously and engage with people in more meaningful ways, where the participation level of people has to increase so that people will feel not being left behind. But that's a political issue that's not necessarily to be solved by a religious perspective. Thank you.